Hi, everybody. Welcome to Stump the Monk. Today, we're going to be talking to my friend Claire Bonham, who is Claire Chuck Bonham is a herbalist, a witch, and the program director at Sojourn Chaplaincy. We're going to have a lovely conversation about chaplaincy, about herbalism, about witchcraft, and the practice of all of those things in our daily life so that we can all learn a little something about how to be in the world. So let's get started with your questions before we connect with Claire. So our first question is,
Since the holidays are coming up, a lot of holiday traditions are tied to a specific faith. How does having a faith that isn't necessarily part of that balance
right.
with the joyous traditions of holidays?
Well, I think it's really interesting because I think more and more people are sort of identifying as spiritual and not religious. And I think also there's a lot more sort of crossover of spiritual traditions. So, you're Jewish and Buddhist, or you're, a witchy Christian, or, like there's this way in which things cross over. So I don't think that the lines are so clear cut, but then also the you can celebrate the good parts of traditions without um, without necessarily connecting to the more painful or oppressive parts. I think specifically about Thanksgiving and how in a lot of places it's now becoming Indigenous Peoples Day, and I think that in my own personal life, like I have Friendsgiving, or we have Thanksgiving that recognizes that we're living on stolen land and all of those things. So, we can celebrate the kind of idealism of the thing, which is, getting together and gratitude and expressions of recognition of um, love and harm, the place in our life where we connect with each other without necessarily forgetting that there's a genocidal history to it, and there's all of these problems with it, which is why I really like that we're changing it to Indigenous People Day, because it does bring to mind and remind us that we live in a country that was stolen, and that has lots of impacts on various areas, and but we can still celebrate the good part of what it means, the harvest festival, the life of abundance, the connections, the community, and how we come together. You know, I'm not a Christian. Christmas, but I still love Christmas. I love to, give silly presents to my friends and gather together and, enjoy the winter light and the celebration of winter as a process. And, like, yeah, there's Christian elements to it, but there's also pagan elements and all these other elements. So I think just remember that you can celebrate the holidays in whatever way you feel comfortable with.
What is your definition of meditation?
So for me, meditation is connecting to the quiet, upright, and stable place that we all sort of have within us. And I think that for me, it helps support my practice of compassion and chaplaincy and being in the world in a particular kind of way, to spend time each day slowing down, getting quiet, and finding a place of settledness, which happens in meditation. And there are various sort of techniques and ideas about all of that, but at the end of the day, it's really about finding the place of stable, quiet, upright, um, just sort of stable, upright, and quiet that can then, you know, offer us the ability to hear the quieter things that happen in our life, right? Like, so the quiet voice of appropriate responses, I don't think that what connects us speaks super loudly. So, having the opportunity to be quiet for a few minutes every day helps me connect to the things that happen quietly. things in mind.
Yeah.
That's why I use my name.
Say more. I don't know.
So Daigon is my Dharma name. It's the name I was given when I was ordained. And it's Japanese for great vow. And when I I was living in the temple, but I was spending a lot of time out of the temple, going to school and working and all of that stuff. I wanted to do something to kind of keep what was important in front of me. And so my teacher and I talked about like, oh, let's just use your name because the vow is sort of what's most important. And so, yeah, that's why I started using Daigon instead of my given name. And now it's sort of become this interesting piece because it's like, who calls me what?
Yeah.
And when?
Totally.
Because, you know, there's Daigon, there's Sister Mary Mayhem, there's Sister, there's... So there's all kinds of expressions of me.
When you started using the name Daigon, like how did that change things for you in terms of your walk?
Well, I think that it really helped me settle into making my life about what's important to me, which is, you know, being in the world in a particular kind of way. Right? And so all of my teaching even now is still sort of being in the world in a particular kind of way and figuring out like, oh, okay, what does that look like? What does that mean? How can we understand that? Because I think we all live by a vow, whether we admit it or not, whether we acknowledge it or not. We all have these intentions, right? Like, this is how I want to be in the world, and we all keep trying to reach that. So for me, it was really like an ability to kind of settle into that. And then also when people use it, it reminds me, oh yeah. Or when I say, like, I introduce myself and hi, I'm Daigon, in my mind, it translates instantly to vow. And so, yeah, it just...
Does it, like, which vow does it connect you with? Or kind of just all of them?
All
or
of them.
different ones at different times?
Yeah. I mean, when you're ordained, you sort of take 16 precepts, right? But I think vow is even deeper than precepts. Like, vow is really our intention for how we want to be in the world. Vow is like what moves us, right? And so getting in touch with, even on top of the precepts, which kind of to me feel like an orientation in the world, vow is sort of the engine that makes us move in those directions, right? And sort of examine that.
Do you feel like that's a vow that you took in this life, or do you feel like it touches into other lives and other realms?
Well, I don't actually worry much about other lives or other realms. It's not a concern for me. Like, I spend so much time dealing with death that I just sort of feel like I'm much more interested in this life and how do I live this life, and can I take care of this life in such a way that whatever moves forward is wholesome, right? And if I focus on taking care of this life, then whatever happens next, which none of us can ever really know, it's like, it'll kind of take care of itself, and I just do the best I can here. So, but I do think it's a vow I took long before I ordained or found Buddhism or even thought about religion or had language, because I can look back on my life and see the places where I would, like being a chaplain, like even before I had language for it, I look back during the crisis, right? During the AIDS Holocaust, and I realized that my time there was spent being a chaplain. I spent a lot of time at bedsides, spent a lot of time with families, I spent a lot of time sort of talking about grief or being in grief. So like at the time I didn't know what it was, but then when I found out, like, oh, there's this thing called chaplaincy, and there's this way we can be with each other, that's how you've been being with people anyway. So let's see if we can find our way to making it into a livelihood. So and that sort of all transpired as I started to work on my own grief. So it sort of coincided with like my own kind of breaking up, like my own kind of falling apart kind of thing, which led me to Buddhism, which led me to Zen hospice, which led me to dealing with my grief and realizing, oh, the grief is at the center of all this falling apart that's happening, and and learning like, oh wait, but it can be transformed, like it can be useful. It doesn't have to be debilitating. It's not a big giant rock I carry around now. It's sort of a flower, and so. And in that process, I learned about chaplaincy as a profession, like a way to be in the world that could be supported. And, you know, and I don't necessarily fit the model now of an ideal chaplain, but at the same time, I see all of the ways in which I do it. Even when I'm teaching, like to me, that's sort of community chaplaincy. You know, this podcast feels like community chaplaincy to me. So, you know, it's all the same thing. But I think, you know, you're a chaplain too, and you've worked really hard to sort of, you've professionalized in a way that I started to and then couldn't. So I'm interested in finding out, like, what brought you here, you know, and what, like, your spiritual practice. I really wanted to start there, you know, earth-based spiritual practice. What does that give you? You know, how do you practice that on a daily basis, and how does that move you and then bring you to chaplaincy, right?
Yeah. Well, my spiritual tradition, you know, I found earth-based religion at a very young age. I come from a long line of Catholics on both sides, but my parents left the church for a number of different reasons. They were married in the church. I was baptized mostly because my very Irish Catholic grandmother would have, like, literally committed a crime had we not been baptized. She would have, like,
grandmothers are like that.
Especially very religious ones. And my parents had left the church, and, you know, she kind of wore them down, I think, and, you know, kept saying, you know, you got to take those kids to church or they're going to go to hell. You got to take them to church or they're going to go to hell. My parents were finally like, you know, all right, you know, and so when I was 7 or 8, they went back and forth. There was a very progressive Catholic community in Arlington, Virginia, where I grew up, and then there was also a Unitarian church, and they kind of went back and forth between the two. And they landed at the Unitarian church. And sometimes I wonder, like, how might my life be different had they chosen that Catholic congregation instead of the Unitarian one? Because I feel like it was a decision that had a big impact on my life, because religious education in the Unitarian Universalist tradition is very much about, because UUism is really about it's a very diverse spiritual tradition.
Right.
There's a lot of belief-wise, there's a lot of different beliefs, and the religious education is really designed to teach you, you know, some people believe this, and other people believe this, and other people believe this, and, you know, what do you believe? What resonates with truth for you?
Right.
Which is, you know, I didn't really realize it at the time, just how radical I think that kind of education, that kind of spiritual education was at the time, certainly. When I was 9, I got interested in witchcraft. They had, you know, I got a book on teen witches, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is me. And they're, you know, and so I, you know, came home one day. My parents had found I was trying to do magic, kind of pulling some herbs out of the kitchen, and, you know, and kind of piecing things together, sticks from the backyard, and, you know, from the oak tree, and my parents, you know, had found my stuff, and they said, you know, if you're interested in witchcraft, there's witches at the church. And I was like, because I thought I was busted, you know.
Yeah.
And so I met with my Jewish ecofeminist UU minister, who was leading the congregation that I was a part of, Reverend Joan Gelbine. And she gave me a couple books. One was Starhawk's, The Spiral Dance,
Right.
Which is kind of a classic. And the other one was Margot Adler's Drawing Down the Moon, and then connected me with the pagan group at the church. And so I had this really privileged experience as a child. I didn't understand how privileged this was,
Right.
of having elders and people to teach me about earth-based religion. Um, how I found chaplaincy was really at the bedside of a dear friend who suddenly started having seizures one day, and it was, and then she ended up in the, they took her to the hospital, and then she was in the hospital, and then they had to put her in a coma, and then, so she was in a coma in the ICU at one of the hospitals here in the city for months, and it was gnarly. I mean, it was grueling. It was horrible. I mean, it was just horrible, and it's so difficult to have a loved one go through something like that, and it was somewhere at the bedside, trying to support her partner, and organizing rituals for our friend group, and navigating dynamics with her homophobic mother, and all of this, that I kind of was like, oh, I think I'm supposed to do this,
Right.
And I remember at one point in the hospital, I was in the elevator, and there was a monk. He was a Franciscan monk in the elevator. And I looked at him, and I was like, what are you doing here? He's like, oh, I visit patients here. And I was like, huh. And it was like something kind of clicked, and I mean,
Right.
I wasn't going to become a Franciscan monk, but it was definitely like, oh, there's a role for spirituality in this place. And I was like, gosh, what would it be like if somebody who could speak our language, somebody who, was familiar with what we needed, was here for us right now.
Right.
And so I kind of sat with that, and I think in 2009, after the crash, the economic downturn, I got laid off of my job as a faith-based organizer, and had been thinking I wanted to go to seminary, because I had been called to go to seminary for many years, actually since I was a kid, really. I kind of felt like I was in, priestessing in the group that I was a part of as a young person, and I kind of felt like, oh, this is part of my path, but I always thought, oh, well, I'll do that when I'm old. It's like, you got to be old to do that, right? You can't be like, 20 and be a minister, that would be like, and so...
and especially when your tradition doesn't necessarily have a traditional kind of ministerial training path, or even a ministerial position.
That's right.
So, like the idea of like, oh, seminary, when you're from a tradition that doesn't necessarily even, that's not the way that they train people.
That's right. And I mean, I think that's part of the beauty of earth-based religion, and, is that it's accessible. The community, one of the communities that I'm a part of here is called Reclaiming, and it's a non-hierarchical style of leadership, and very much, some of our values are really around raising, getting folks to a place quickly where they can lead, right? And then taking turns. We hold a circle and kind of take turns stepping into the circle and support each other in leadership, really, so that, partially because, it's easy to get out of balance if you're leading all the time, right? And so this is one of the ways that we have balance in the circle. And also because it's leadership development,
Right.
I think it's how...
It's a very Quaker approach, right? Where the leadership is this shared kind of, whoever gets touched in that moment to share something, to bring something in.
It's funny you use them as an example, because sometimes when I'm talking to Christians and I'm trying to explain, I'm kind of like, we're kind of like the Quakers, but we worship a little more like Pentecostals, so. That sounds weird, but and so I had thought I was going to go to seminary. I actually got accepted into the UU seminary at the GTU, and then I was like, I'm too much of a freaky queer witch to do any of this. Well, why am I going to seminary? Like, I'm a weirdo, I'm a queer, I'm like, like this is not, no. So,
now was it more that it wasn't for you, or was it more this, because for me, when I went to seminary, it was more sort of like, there's no place for me there. right? Like I'm a big giant queer, sissy, nun, monk, hybrid person who just, who's, my practice is so kind of radical in so many ways, especially as a Buddhist, that I just felt like at the beginning, I thought, oh, there's no place for me in the seminarial place. Like, even the places that claim to be ecumenical or claim to be queer friendly, like, because even in queer circles, I'm kind of a giant weirdo anyway.
I laugh because I can relate, yeah.
So my question is, was it more that you were concerned that there wasn't a place for you, or was it more like, I'm not sure that that's what I should be doing? Or that,
it was a little of both. I think that I wasn't sure if there was a place for me. I think there was a little bit of internalized homophobia. When we were talking about kind of this conversation beforehand, one of the things that, we talked a little bit about, I think that you're hoping with the show is that it's about kind of how can our spiritual practices ground us in the day-to-day?
Right.
Like what does spiritual practice actually look like in terms of
practical life? Like, how does this...
And so I think, one of the ways that chaplaincy, I feel like part of what we're doing as chaplains, you talked about earlier during the epidemic, how, your grief was a guide for you in your path as a chaplain, and how what was a rock kind of blossomed into a flower through that alchemical process of healing. And I think that, that's part of what we do as chaplains, is to help facilitate that process of the rock blossoming into the flower.
Right.
And we do these kind of like interventions that are, often we don't have that many interactions with folks.
Right.
So they're just, subtle, small, but really deep, powerful interventions to help facilitate that process.
Right.
And that's ideal, in the ideal world. And I think part of how we do that is by going there with patients.
Right.
And that's a lot of what the training as a chaplain is about how to not move away from pain.
Right.
How to not move away from the darkness, but instead turn towards the darkness, knowing that there's healing that can only happen in the dark.
Right.
The soil, right? The soil. If we think about like the earth when you're tending to a garden, right? You want that dark, rich soil because that's what grows the best vegetables. That's what grows the strongest plants, is that rich darkness. And so I think it's, in terms of what's the takeaway that folks, can have with chaplaincy, I think a lot of it's like, how do we learn to be present with each other's darkness? Right.
Well, and I think it's, I think part of chaplaincy and how you become a chaplain and all of that training is really like, you have to do your own work, right?
Yeah.
Like, I can spend time at the bedside of people who are dying and with families who are in deep grief because I did my own grief work, and I'm not afraid of my grief now, and I can, like, I recognize the transformative nature of it.
Yeah.
And so sometimes really just being able to be with people in these extremely painful moments and just be able to rest there with them and not run away, I think is what makes chaplaincy so powerful.
Absolutely. Well, and I think that, circling back to my story,
right.
I think that was part of how I found chaplaincy, was in that dark time in my life. I went along and, studied plants and got deep with the plants, and then was drawn back to chaplaincy. It was like there was something that kind of pulled me back. And part of it was that I found that I was having these, like, and as an energetic herbalist, part of the training is, it's deeper than I think Western herbalism, in terms of, I spend 2 hours doing an intake with somebody, an hour and a half maybe, if it's going fast. And often we don't touch on everything that we need to touch on, partially because I'm tracking folks and I'm kind of following folks down the rabbit hole, similar to what we do in chaplaincy. And I realized that, I didn't want to just be working with folks one-on-one, doing consultations the way you do as an herbalist.
Right.
I really wanted to be focused on working with folks in a public health setting.
Right.
And so
Bringing your community building into
yeah.
this practice,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely, absolutely. And so I went to seminary, and I actually went to 2 seminaries because, you know, when you're a minority, you work twice as hard, right? You know, and there's not a lot of witches in chaplaincy.
No, yeah.
It's pretty unusual. And although I suspect that that's going to change in the next 10 years. I think we're going to see some big changes there.
I think so too. Like, I think that there's a lot more people who are starting to sort of be out around that stuff and be sort of like, no, this is it, and I'm real, and I exist, and
well, it's cool. I mean, right now we're going through a time when, like, there's a real resurgence of witchcraft, and this is a whole other conversation that we can have. You know, it's interesting. It's a very interesting time to be somebody who's practiced these ways for almost 3 decades.
Right.
If I'm seeking healing, you know, and support from somebody, you know, how is their practice a circle? How are they giving back in there to the lineage that they're connected with? You know, my teachers who I've studied with, you know, I feel very committed to them, you know, and so I go up to the land when I can and, you know, help clean, you know, help prepare for the winter, or, you know, I mean, kind of, you know, and there's at this point it feels like it's a life commitment kind of relationship, you know, because there's a reciprocity. I've been given a tremendous gift to be connected with this lineage. I'm not Choctaw, and so it's not, you know, I don't claim to, you know, own that lineage in any way. I'm not going to teach that lineage because it's not mine to teach. I'm not going to make money off of that lineage, right? You know, I mean, I think it's, you know, it's complicated, and you know, where's the reciprocity? I think is
it's a great question, right? When you're looking at these things, and and I think that's always what I ask when as a disabled person or as a person who lives in the world, and I go to sort of seek healing. That's one of the questions I always ask is like, so what's your, you know, what are you tied to? What's your, you know, what's your commitments here? Because again, going back to this place of vow, right? And living out a vow. And how that works. Now, I do want to spend some time, you're the program director at Sojourn Chaplaincy, where I'm on the board. And Sojourn Chaplaincy.
Yay, Sojourn.
Yay! At San Francisco General. Check us out at sojournchaplaincy.org. But I want to say, recently, Sojourn started, through your sort of emphasis and pushing, you know, we created this thing called Trans Spiritual Care Initiative, which is blossoming and really kind of meeting a deep need for to provide spiritual care to some of the most marginalized people within the world, but also in our communities, and particularly here in San Francisco. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that practice of that, and also sort of how that, you know, I mean, it came about in a time which felt really connected to what was happening in my community and my circle, but also I know it you know, it grew out of your own commitments and your own community, and I want to talk a little bit about how that's a practice and how that came about. And
yeah, totally. Well, you know, I think really, in a lot of ways, the work began years ago. In 2013, you know, the law changed here in California. And, you know, before 2013, there was something called the trans exclusion in health insurance policies, in most health insurance policies. And so even if an employer wanted to buy health insurance that would support their trans employees in getting the health care that they needed, they couldn't even get that plan. And in 2013, a judge here in California ruled that it was against the California Constitution. And so it kind of opened the doors for a lot of folks to have access to health care that folks had not had before.
And I think specifically in San Francisco, too, because San Francisco actually started to pay city employees the cost for their trans health care. and started paying for surgeries long. I think it was before that.
Yeah, it was early 2000s. Yeah.
And so, that too, I think, also added to this, and also the, Affordable Care Act then also opened up insurance to a lot of people who didn't have it
and that's
before.
kind of been bigger throughout the country, I think.
Right.
Has changed things, which has been amazing.
Right.
And in the role that I'm in my spiritual community, there's a lot of gender diversity in my spiritual community, and so as folks were starting to access healthcare institutions in ways that we hadn't been able to before. Folks knew I was doing chaplaincy, and so
Right.
people started coming to me with these stories about interactions they'd had with chaplains that were like, oh boy. And so, I kind of would get on the phone and call the spiritual director of, whatever hospital and try to do some like advocacy.
Right.
And, that was kind of, I mean, that's good, and, but it's not enough, right?
Right.
And, when I started working at Sojourn, I realized that this was education, because a lot of the mistakes folks were making, I think chaplains were making, was really just education. Like they
Right.
didn't understand gender diversity. And that was a big part of the problem. Because I think most chaplains are pretty well-intended folks who
Right.
really do want to meet someone where they're at, and they want to do what they can to be culturally responsive. Because
Right.
as we've been talking about, it's so much part of our value system and the way we practice
Right.
chaplaincy is about meeting someone as they are, where
Right.
they're at, and
learning the appropriate ways to interact to people across cultural
right.
and community difference.
That's right. Yeah, absolutely. And so what happened, and so I realized that, we needed this education at Sojourn, right?
Right.
Like our chaplains needed more
Right.
education around gender diversity. And so started a training and kind of, we got a very small grant from the Horizons Foundation, which enabled us to, gave me some capacity to start reaching out to trans clergy and leaders to talk with them about, like, what would you want in training for chaplains, right? What do you think would be important in a curriculum? And then we were able to contract with some folks here in the community to help kind of develop the first curriculum and do some of our pilot trainings, and spent a couple of years kind of piloting it. And then, a lot of the clergy that I had been kind of one-on-one having conversations with, many of them, and leaders, many of them then got involved in a clergy contingent that we had kind of a consultation process with.
Right. And these were all trans clergy people.
Yes, yeah, all
Right.
trans and non-binary clergy folks. Really important, I think, to and everybody we've contracted with has also been trans and non-binary. I think, because nothing about us without us, right?
Right, yeah.
I mean, I think that slogan that came out of the disability rights movement is really important in any kind of advocacy.
Right. Well, and that's how we, it's culturally appropriate, right? Like we're trying to recognize and also to drive resources into communities that are affected.
Yeah.
I think that's also part of what's great about the commitment with the Trans-Spiritual Care Initiative has been that we're driving resources into a community that didn't have access to a lot of resources prior to, as far as spiritual care and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think that's the hope, little by
Right.
little, what happened with the curriculum, so we kind of formed the curriculum, and and the clergy that we're meeting with were really like, this is a wonderful curriculum, we need to get it out there, and we really need this to be taught by trans people.
Right.
And that's really important because it's really different when it's somebody who's not trans teaching
Right.
the curriculum. And so this summer we did a training of trainers. So some of those folks in that original contingent got involved, and some other folks. So now we have a core of, I think it's 11 trainers who are trained at this point, who kind of have different areas of specialty and expertise. And we're in the process of doing these trainings in different places. So we've trained at this point, since the project's inception, we've trained, I think it's over 200 chaplains at this point throughout the country.
Throughout the country,
throughout the country. And we're working on expanding that and, providing education and training for spiritual care providers, chaplains, we did one of them at a congregation because there was a congregation that was interested, and they have lay chaplains in the congregation.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
Who do chaplaincy in the community, and so I think that's something that we're wondering about is kind of like, there's a real need for this in congregations.
Right.
So if somebody out there has an idea, wants to take it and run with it.
Well, because I think that spiritual care is way broader than just in hospitals, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Chaplains exist in prisons and in the military, and there's so many places that we operate as chaplains that, being able to sort of respond to, because I think, even in my own community, trying to develop the ability for people to go and visit people who are sick in the community who maybe aren't in the hospital, but they're, stuck at home for a couple of weeks recuperating or something. Like being able to send chaplains there who are trained is also really an awesome gift.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
And especially the, culturally appropriate ones. Like, I think about the conversations I've had with friends and families of people and the difficult sort of, one of the things chaplains do is help facilitate difficult conversations, and difficult, help families have conversations that may be harder to have, right?
Yeah.
So, like you and I have both had the instances of homophobic families coming into queer sick people's lives and sort of blowing them up. And having having clergy and chaplains who can help have that conversation so that it doesn't have to blow up and that people can see the objectivity of like, oh, this is real and it's healthy and it's okay, and parents who just maybe don't understand what their kids going through.
No.
So so we have 11 trainers, and
I think it's 11.
right. And so how is it that people can contact you if they're interested?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so glad you asked. Transspiritualcare.org is our website for the Transspiritual Care Project, and there's a free download. So if folks want it's just really basic Trans 101, but it's a good place to start.
Right.
So if anybody who's watching this, if your spiritual community, or you want to familiarize yourself with gender diversity and some elements of that, this is it's a great place to start. And there's also information on there about how to get in touch with us, some of the services that we provide.
That's awesome.
Yeah, a little bit more about our trainers.
Right. That's awesome, though.
Yeah, it's great.
And so the other thing I want to talk about with Sojourn in particular is that we have the spring training coming up.
Yeah.
So, it's an opportunity for people in San Francisco to train to be chaplains.
That's right, yeah.
And volunteer to help out, because Sojourn provides chaplain services, and they're the only ones providing chaplain services at San Francisco General Hospital.
That's right.
And they're all volunteers. And so you can come and be trained and volunteer.
Yeah, so the training program, it's 120 hours, 60 minimum, 60 hours of class time, and then a minimum of 60 hours of clinical time. I encourage folks to spend more time with patients. You'll get more out of the class if you spend more time with patients. We focus on, some fundamentals of chaplaincy, just kind of some fundamental listening skills. And then the second part is about spiritual assessment and intervention. And so it's a good grounding in compassionate care. I think we've had a lot of really wonderful graduates. Some folks go on to do CPE and professional chaplaincy training, clinical pastoral education is what CPE stands for. Some folks have gone on and done training as therapists. Some folks have gone into medicine.
Right.
Some folks come to us as retirees, retired medical, providers, retired nurses. We had a retired healthcare administrator, a hospital administrator, who was a dedicated volunteer for many years.
Right.
So folks kind of come from a lot of different backgrounds, but sometimes there's a core group of folks who are retired who are interested in service, and And I think it's a wonderful way to find connection and meaning after for many folks who've gotten to a place in their life where they don't have to work, can't work.
Yeah, and we've had volunteers who have been with us for years. I mean, we don't have a huge amount of turnover, really, when you compare it to sort of other spiritual care departments. And I think that says something about how we train them and how we support them in the work. And
absolutely. Well, and
so what are the dates of the training?
Oh, the dates of the training are the second weekend in February until I think it's the third weekend in May.
Okay.
And I'm sorry I don't have them off the top of my head there for you.
SojournChaplaincy.org. They can find out more about that.
Find out there. It's a fantastic program. I think it'll be a good class this spring. It's usually a pretty broad range of folks.
Right.
We try to, select for diversity to have as diverse a group as possible. And part of that is also, the San Francisco General Hospital, if folks don't know, it's the city's only trauma center. It's the city's only public hospital. So that means that, all the major traumas in the city come to the General. It also means that many of the folks that we serve don't have health insurance or are underinsured or have public health insurance.
Right.
And so we're working with a lot of folks who are marginalized and or struggling against some kind of oppression. I think, a lot of folks that we serve have recently migrated to the United States. We serve a lot of folks who are living on the streets, struggling with mental health challenges. We're the sole provider of psychiatric emergency services in the city. And so we work with a lot of folks who are in acute mental health crises. And then we also serve, I think this is true everywhere because substance abuse is a struggle across communities and across populations. Excuse me. And we serve many people who are struggling with substance abuse challenges. We also serve a lot of, folks who are African American, many LGBT folks. I think in the LGBT community, we serve some of the more marginalized members of the LGBT community. It's a very diverse community of folks, diverse communities of folks that we serve. I think, over 30% of our patients are Latinx.
And a large portion of the Latinx population are also monolingual Spanish.
Right. Yeah.
So, that's another, we've done some trainings, Spanish language trainings.
We have, we did several trainings for Eucharistic ministers who are Catholic volunteers who bring communion to Catholic Spanish-speaking patients. We've done that in Spanish. And we also have the Spanish-only, the city's only Spanish grief group, which is kind of appalling if you think about it, that there's only one. But Ileana Labergere, who's a fantastic chaplain and grief facilitator, runs that group. It's the third Wednesday of every month from 2 to 3:30 p.m.
And you leave those moments and you just feel like, oh my gosh, I'm so grateful I get to do this. I get to be there.
And the wisdom, I think that's the thing about, church ministry or congregational life or, life in community and in leadership often, we're supposed to be the ones who are like espousing the wisdom or whatever. And I feel like as a chaplain, like my job is to like kind of help pull it out of you.
Right, yeah.
And so it's like, oh, it's like, wow, humans are brilliant. You know what I mean? Like it's fascinating and beautiful. All of the wisdom that we have, and I feel like just like the soil, the dark soil is needed for that rich flower to blossom. It's in the darkness.
Well, and I think that in my tradition, Zen sort of says that you have everything you need. You're already enlightened. You're already awake. And so my job as a chaplain is to provide space that's quiet enough for you to access that, right? Your own innate goodness. But another, the great thing about being a chaplain too, and you mentioned you say you're a chaplain, and I say I'm a hospice chaplain, and people are just like, oh my God, all that death and dying, and I'm like, yeah, but that's the only way I could live. Like, it's what saved me was chaplaincy. But early on, I remember one of my early patients saying, the hard part for me is to just let my heart break. Because what did he say? When my heart's broken, when it comes back together, it's larger because of the scarring. Because it sort of expands as it comes back together. And I care, like that idea of like this broken heart, like, can I just let my heart break every day? Including when I'm at the bedside, like some of the stories and some of the situations, and you just to be there and like just go, no, I'm going to let my heart break in this moment with these people. We're all going to be here together, heartbroken.
Hey everyone, it's Fred, the producer and editor of the show. Thank you so much for listening to the podcast. We hope you enjoyed the episode, and hey, if you'd like to support the show, make sure to follow our social media accounts that are listed on the screen right now. And if you're able to, go ahead and donate to our Patreon. That keeps the show alive and hopefully a better quality for you as well. You can also gain early access to these episodes by doing that, and get even longer versions of these episodes for your long commute or chores around the house or whatever you're doing when you're listening to this podcast. We hope you enjoy future episodes and have a good one.